Aladdin 2019 was directed by Ritchie, and is yet another one of these live-action remakes of classic Disney animated films, this time with the basis being the 1992 animated classic of the same name. For anyone who's not familiar with the original story though, it is based on a classic folk tale from Middle Eastern culture, Aladdin and the Magic Lamp. The story follows the 1992 film pretty closely though, in which we follow a street urchin named Aladdin who's living in a town called Agrabah. Circumstances lead him to one day discovering a magic lamp in a cave of wonders, in which once he realizes that it contains a genie who can grant him 3 wishes, he decides to use these 3 wishes for his own will, and also to gain favor of the princess in the kingdom.
You stumbled upon an opportunity.
Hopefully turn his own favor around and make things better for himself.
I can make you rich.
Before I go further with my thoughts, I should probably say that the original Aladdin was never one of my personal favorite Disney films. I know that's definitely different than most people because it is a highly beloved and very well regarded Disney film. But for me, growing up, a lot of the Disney films that I appreciated were the ones that actually aren't as talked about enough. Films like The Sword and the Stone, Fox and the Hound, Emperor's New Groove, 101 Dalmatians. These are the ones that I think stood out to me more because their storytelling was a little bit more offbeat, and I think just the fact that they weren't talked about enough, I felt like I should champion them more. But I don't know, they otherwise just spoke to me more on an emotional level. So you could argue that me not really having much anticipation for this movie could have hurt my experience. But on the flip side, this allowed me to approach Aladdin from a more unbiased or without any real nostalgic for the original. Sure, I don't really have any particular interest or love for these live-action remakes, but I guess the fact that I've never really been attached to the original film was something that didn't really hamper my experience going into this movie, and I didn't really have any real anticipation for it. As a result, my experience was alright, and I would say that I'm pretty much split down the middle on this movie. I'll go ahead and get the positives out of the way first. I think this cast, for the most part, has been brought together pretty well. Naomi Scott as Jasmine was a great choice, both because of her appearance and the performance she gives. I think she fills the role quite well. And actually, she brings something to the performance that makes Jasmine a better character in this movie than she was in the original. Quite frankly, in the original movie, Jasmine could have been a lot more dynamic, and she could have been a much better female representation in that movie. Disney did a lot better job in this Aladdin remake at making Jasmine someone who girls can look up to as a role model, because in this movie Jasmine is a figure who has been kind of shut out in her own life, and she hasn't really had that many opportunities to blossom into her own personality. And so throughout this movie you get opportunities to witness Jasmine grow out of this and to become more of her own individual person, especially with how her character arc ends in the movie, which I think is particularly satisfying, especially for my mom who went to this movie with me. That was one of the key reasons why she actually likes this movie more than the original, just because the progression of Jasmine's character from how she is in the beginning to the end has a stronger feminist message in a way that isn't really pushed at you. It's something that I think a lot of girls will be able to take plenty of inspiration and satisfaction from, and I appreciated it too. Additionally, one of the other things that people were very worried about going into this movie was Will Smith as the genie, simply because of the visuals in the trailer didn't exactly promise anything realistic or, quite frankly, enjoyable to look at. And yes, there is certainly an aspect of uncanny valley to his character because of things that I can't really fully explain. I think it has to do with the fact that when you're contrasting Mena Massoud as Aladdin, and then you have this giant version of a blue CGI Will Smith hovering above him, it does look awkward, and it's very easy to tell that this is CGI. And then of course, just the way that he moves around certain scenes, sometimes it just comes across very fake. But that's not really Will Smith's fault at all. I think he gives a lot of charisma and energy into this role, as you might expect him to. That's just who Will Smith is. But the fact that what I appreciated about his character is that he actually brought his own personality into the character. It never really came across as Will Smith trying to be a Robin Williams genie. Will Smith was doing his own interpretation of the character, and I think that works because the film also allowed him to use the music in such a way that it kind of matches his own style of music and singing and rapping, of course. That might turn off some people, but for me, I think it was definitely enjoyable enough to see him have his own personality in the role. And whenever he was on screen, I actually found myself quite enjoying myself. As far as Mena Massoud as Aladdin goes, I think he does the job decently well. There's nothing particularly compelling about what he does on screen, but I think he fills the role suitably enough. In terms of production design and costuming, I think this remake is definitely an improvement over some of the other ones that have came out before, particularly Beauty and the Beast. There's no character design that really comes across as awkward or inferior to what the original film was. Like, they make sense within the world that is created here in this Aladdin movie, while also paying enough homage and appreciation for what was created in that 1992 classic. And there's definitely a stronger color palette too that's in this film that hasn't really been present in the other remakes, so I appreciated that. There's definitely more to take from this film that is visually pleasing, colorful, and enjoyable just from an artistic perspective. However, that does lead me into my negatives on this movie, in that when you have a director like Guy Ritchie, you would think there'd be a lot more opportunities for him to bring his own visual style into what he does. But watching this movie, I never really felt like Guy Ritchie's voice as a visual artist came through. It still felt like a very corporate controlled production with visuals that are calculated, bland, and don't really have that much style to them. And that's a shame, because Guy Ritchie has definitely developed a reputation as a stylistic director with films like Snatch, the Sherlock Holmes movies with Jude Law and Robert Downey Jr., Man from U.N.C.L.E. I can go on with all the films that he's made that feel like Guy Ritchie movies, but Aladdin never really feels like that to me. It just kind of has a bland visual direction overall, and despite having some very fun musical sequences and images that are done with some pretty impressive CGI. And another thing that ties into that is I feel that this movie is so indebted to the original classic that it felt like this movie was just a greatest hits version of the original movie that just happens to be in live action. And that doesn't always work when you have characters like Raja the tiger, or Iago the parrot, or something like even Abu. Some of these things just don't work when transferring over from a cartoon into live action, because it conflicts with the tone that this movie should have, which is a bit more serious and more grounded in reality. And then these things are here simply because they're things that people would remember from the original classic, but they make the film less grounded in reality than it should be, despite the fact that it's a fantasy movie. To me, when you're making something into live action, and you're taking something that was a cartoon originally, sure, you're gonna have some semblance of affinity and appreciation for what that film originally was. But if you're gonna do a remake, you should at least put enough of a spin on the material to make it more realistic and sensible within the rules of its own universe. I think Cinderella 2015 was a good example of this, because when you look at the 1950 original, you have the mice characters who are there that, you know, create Cinderella's dresses, and most of the screen time is focused on them, you know, talking amongst each other, cracking jokes, and doing things to help Cinderella. But that sort of thing wouldn't really work well in a live action movie, especially when mice would be created with CGI. So those characters are pretty much put on the wayside, and then Cinderella and her relationship with the prince in that movie was more front and center, and I think that was a wise choice to make in that film. But Aladdin, you don't really get any of that sort of creativity with the storytelling. It really is just going beat for beat of how the original film was, with added scenes here and there that don't really add much to the story overall. Of course, this makes for conflicting tones, scenes that kind of just drag the story out unnecessarily, and I also have to say that Jafar in this movie, no. That's not necessarily a knock against the actor, because I'm sure he's a very nice and talented person, but the direction and the dialogue that he was given was just so bad. I never once felt that this character was intimidating or really added anything that was going to present a realistic challenge to Aladdin. Honestly, I feel like he was just here just because we knew there was a Jafar character in the original movie, and so they had to translate him into this, but they don't really do enough with the screenplay or the direction of his performance to make him feel intimidating, enjoyable to watch. He just kind of felt awkward on screen whenever he would come on, and that is definitely an issue for me in the final act of this movie, which I frankly hated for a number of reasons I won't get into for spoilers' sake, but he just didn't work for me at all in this movie, and I think that's a huge detriment to this film, because Jafar was one of the most memorable elements of the original, and so translating that ineffectively from the original to this was a huge flaw in my opinion. However, as a whole, I don't really consider Aladdin 2019 to be quite as offensive or frustrating to me as the Dumbo remake by Tim Burton was. It's enjoyable. There's definitely some interesting visuals going on here, and the performances by Will Smith and Naomi Scott in particular are very enjoyable and add something to the original that wasn't necessarily there. But because I am pretty much split and down the middle on this movie, I'm going to reflect that with my score, which is going to be a C. And I don't really have to give an age recommendation for this movie, because overall, the elements of the original have been translated pretty well here in terms of just family-friendly content, and so I would just go ahead and say that all ages are recommended to watch this movie. Thanks again for watching this review, guys. I appreciate your continuous support for my channel. Look forward to my next video, which is going to be about Godzilla King of the Monsters, which should hopefully be out in the next couple of days. I know that the amount of content I've been given lately has been a bit stretched out, but that's because I've been doing a lot of roundtable reviews with my buddies Justin and Jared. Expect the next few videos to be a bit more down-to-earth reviews like this, which will hopefully mean that I'll be able to put out more. So I appreciate your patience and your continual support, and I hope to be able to provide more content for you guys pretty soon. If you like this, please feel free to check out my Letterboxd, Facebook, and Instagram pages that are in the description below. You can find the links there. Otherwise, thank you for watching, and you have a good one.